is delivering mission-ready solutions, AI-powered, software-defined, and commercial-first. Combining deep mission experience with commercial partnerships, Booz Allen is defining a new defense industrial base, a network that crosses traditional boundaries to scale non-traditional technologies and brings our best tech to the hands of the warfighter faster, effectively delivering technology for today and tomorrow. Booz Allen, accelerating outcomes for today's warfighters.
Hello and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Seraphin, Executive Director of NDAA's Emerging Technologies Institute. On today's episode, we're taking a closer look at the evolving challenge of research security, a space where protecting U.S. innovation often collides with the natural openness of the academic and even the commercial research environment. Universities, small business, and other entities conducting national security R&D face rising scrutiny, new compliance expectations, and a growing pressure to guard against foreign influence and intellectual property theft. Proposals like the Safe Research Act, which is a part of the House version of the fiscal year 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, are raising questions about scope, definitions, and potential impacts on the research community, universities, industries, and individual researchers, some of whom have natural international ties. This debate has never been more active than we're seeing it today. Today, we're going to talk about what guardrails are in place now, what problems lawmakers are trying to solve with this kind of legislation, and how we can preserve meaningful global collaboration in science while strengthening and maintaining national security. To help us understand these issues and take apart some of these policy ideas, we're joined by Dr. Shanni Silberberg from Lewis-Burke Associates. Shanni, welcome to today's episode.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into this, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to Lewis-Burke?
Sure. So I was always sort of interested in promoting science and innovation. I started by doing it myself. I got a PhD in neuroscience. And then I really wanted to influence kind of science at a national level. So I did a AAA Science Technology Policy Fellowship, which led me to work for the Basic Research Office in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense, now the Undersecretary of War for Research and Engineering. So that was, I was a contractor supporting the Director of Basic Research, which oversaw all of DoD's investment in fundamental research, which largely went to universities. From there, I decided that it was time to do something different, and I joined Lewis-Burke Associates. So Lewis-Burke Associates is a government relations firm that deals with science, technology, health, and education. A lot of our clients are universities, but we also support businesses and associations that are all doing some sort of scientific innovation and in that space. And
Lewis-Burke is a great NDAA member, and in fact, some of your clients, those universities, are also NDAA members. NDAA has got over 50 universities and not-for-profit research institutions that are part of our organization. And so some of these research security questions really hit home to those members. So just to get into it now, research security has been a challenging policy issue for decades. I thought I fixed it many times when I was on the Hill, but I guess not. So just to get people up to speed, what are the basics of the discussions about research security that people have been struggling with for all these years?
Yeah. So the basics are how do we make sure that when we're doing science and innovation and technology development in the U.S., we're not inadvertently giving away our secrets to foreign adversaries or competitors? Largely, the conversation has been focused on China, but also Russia, Iran, and North Korea are countries that are always considered as countries of concern. And I think it's important in that discussion to understand the term foreign influence, right? How are these countries influencing our scientific enterprise? And also the type of research, like what is actually happening, right? So if you are a company, you have intellectual property and you're collaborating with somebody in China, and then China basically learns what you're doing, steals it, and makes their own cheaper version and floods you out of the market. That's a huge problem, but it's very different than if you're an academic researcher collaborating with a scientist and sharing information. And so that then the question is, well, what information sharing is okay? What information sharing is not okay? And does it matter the kind of research that you're doing, the topic? And so this has been, as you know, a big debate about how much do we collaborate, what we collaborate on, what agencies should fund or not fund. Is the Department of Defense or Department of War funding research look different than NIH funding research? And so there's been a lot of legislation and a lot of thought that went into current policies to protect academic research.
And the natural tension we're thinking about here is that, of course, when certain parts of the government or certain companies are funding research, they're doing it for security reasons, right? To develop the next generation of science or thought or even technology that might be useful in a defense, in a military context. Mm-hmm. And so understandably, then, you might want that not to disseminate all over the globe, which is fair. On the other hand, there's something innate about the way innovation and science is done these days, which is inherently open, right? So how do you think about balancing those two? I guess that's the crux of the question.
And I think the question is, why is it open? Why are we actually conducting fundamental research or university research? So the very early stages, why are we doing it in the open? Why are we even talking to China? Why are we talking to Russia? Why are we talking to the UK? And I think the reason is that these problems are really complicated, big questions that require very creative solutions, and they can't actually be done behind closed doors. You need that discussion in the community, the published results, the conferences, the talking, the sourcing ideas from everywhere to make those discoveries that 10 years down the line will result in a technology. That's why we do it, right? So then the question is, okay, well, but what are the risks? We are thinking about this as being downstream and effective. And I think that the answer to that is you have to evaluate it based on the project that you're doing, right? You have to ask yourself, this is the research that I'm doing. Where is China on this? Are they super advanced and I'm not, and I stand more to gain from collaborating with them? Or do they know nothing and my involvement with them is actually going to give something away that maybe I don't want to give away? Or maybe they are not advanced, but they have this one expert that I cannot do my research without engaging with. So it's a nuanced question. It ends up boiling down to, how do you balance the risk and the benefit of collaborating with entities in China?
And this balancing and looking at those risks, this is particularly challenging, I think, for universities and those especially performing national security R&D. So talk about it now from the framework of a university and how it has to think about what you just are trying to balance there.
Yeah. So back in 2018, when we started really understanding what China was trying to do and influence our academic environment, like poach people and pay people for the same research that they were doing for the government, and give people incentives to come to China, it was just kind of coming to light. And all these federal policies started coming out, like, universities, you really have to do this. You can't allow this stuff to happen. And one thing the university community said is, we have no idea how to even determine what is a problematic entity. And so since 2018, there's been a lot of effort of educating academia about what is and isn't an acceptable relationship and unacceptable behavior when you're conducting federal research. And this was an effort that was spearheaded by Congress with legislation and then taken up by the administration, that in the first Trump administration, to create policies that universities could follow and that federal agencies could use to evaluate the risk. And these really came down to, first of all, tell us everything that you're doing, meaning who you're getting money from, who you're collaborating, with in terms of your time, where you're spending your time. And then we, federal agencies, will say whether we think this is appropriate risk and we want to fund you or not, right? And there were standards that came up during the first Trump administration about what those disclosures need to be. And then there are also some really clear-cut rules of like, you shall not do this, right? There are some, for example, there are if people know about foreign talent recruitment plans, these are a way that countries can incentivize somebody to basically do work for them or come to their country. And some of them are totally like actually fine. They're like, you come and you do a teaching appointment every now and then, and it's an exchange, and it's probably not problematic, but some are malign, and they're trying to actually get you to share pre-published results ahead of time or have some sort of agreement where you get your students only, like they pick which students you can train, and they're all from their country. And so there are rules about that. Like you cannot participate in a malign foreign talent program plan and also get federal funding. But the other things are really going to be about nuances and about the agency then, once they have all the information, deciding whether they want to fund you or not based on the risks.
And all of this seems to say that China is different, right? We've done collaborative research with competitor nations forever. I mean, I guess I could argue there was collaborative research with Germany pre-World War II at the basic science level. There was research going on with the Soviet Union all through the Cold War. But are the behaviors of the Chinese in this kind of space, are they different?
That's such a good question. I think it's tricky because I think the difference might just come from how much technology now plays in terms of economic competitiveness in today's world, and a recognition of how important people are to that, like getting the right people to do the work, getting access to the building the capacity to do technology. And China has been on a mission to grow its dominance. And in some ways, the US hasn't really faced a competitor like China, and just in terms of their population and their influence in the global scale and their dependencies. So I don't know that it's necessarily that China wants things that Russia or Germany didn't want at those times, but that the landscape around it has changed about whether we want to be promoting kind of relationships with China. And then, so that's one thing. And then, yes, there are also tools that China is using that I don't think we've seen before from many other countries, like these foreign talent recruitment programs where they have you sign sort of a secret contract to help China effectively behind the back of your own academic institution and behind the backs of the federal government.
So given that the world has changed in the importance of technology and maybe the speed at which technology, even basic research, can get turned into military items or commercial products so quickly, and the different kinds of mechanisms that the Chinese are using, then we've been thinking about this for a while. So right now, what are the systems that are in place to protect American researchers, American institutions, even the taxpayer who helped fund some of the innovation coming out of those places, from things like theft of intellectual property or even unknowing collaboration with we'll call them malign foreign institutions? So what's the framework right now that's in place?
All right. So the first step, the most important step of that framework is figuring out what you're actually funding in the open that is allowed to be in collaboration with China and what you are keeping behind closed doors. Right. So I came from the Department of Defense, and that's the number one question we ask. The Department of Defense, they evaluate first whether this is research that requires that open collaboration. And that they think that the research, that any results are not going to really be a technology for, until like 10 years down the line. And it's really a fundamental question that requires really creative problem solving. That's when they go to academia. That's when they go to the open environment. They think about this in terms of technology readiness levels. Once a technology readiness level is higher up, they start closing more and more doors, right? So they'll classify it, or they'll maybe work with some academic institutions, but only on very, very strict conditions. Like the people have to be all US citizens. They might have to have a clearance. They might have to work in a special facility where nobody else can have access. And then, as you go higher, they start doing it internally in their own labs. So that's step one. First, figure out whether this is even research that should be done in the open. And then you want to do some due diligence about understanding the risks. So for the department, they have a framework that they came up with in 2023, which they have been subsequently updating, which identifies the factors that they think might be indicators of foreign influence or of some sort of conflict and a risk that the department might not want to fund, right? So these are things like potentially collaborations with institutions that are problematic in China and other countries. It's things like patents. Like, if in your history, were you funded by the federal government and you submitted a patent application? Did you submit that patent application in the US? Or did you submit that patent application in a foreign country of concern and not in the US? Or did you submit it in a foreign country of concern before you submitted it in the US? Things that are like indicators that maybe you have an affiliation that you shouldn't have. And then, things like affiliations, like, do you have a position in an institution that you shouldn't have a position in? Are you getting federal funding from an entity of concern? And basically what happens then is you look at all of these factors, and the key piece is then you have the security risk, but then you also have somebody who is technical, who understands the science, who can look at that risk and look at that project and say, okay, I understand these risks for this scientific area. I think that this is or is not a problem. And I can give you an example. So let's say you're doing research on water purity, right? You're trying to understand how to purify water. You're understanding contaminants. And there's a site in China that has measurements that you potentially need. So, and it happens to be that the institution that you need to do the collections with is on a list that we might not like. So, but the department knows that these contaminants could impact our ability to then measure things that we might care about later. So they want to understand that fundamentally. Do you say, no, you can't take these measurements, even though they're the only place in the world, the only person who can help you with those measurements? Or do you say, actually, the risk here is, I understand the risk, but the benefit is so high that I'm going to accept the risk, right? That's one situation. Another situation is China is way ahead in a certain field, and we want to have insight. And the third situation is China is actually doing something that we don't have visibility into, and we actually want to use that basic research collaboration that exists for the US to be able to gain insight into what China is doing. So it's actually an intel mission. And I think it really comes down to making sure that you understand the risk and understand the benefit, which I know I've said a couple times before, but that's really it. And really on a case-by-case basis.
And in all those three models you talked about, are the universities who are getting funding from the Pentagon to do basic research, which might fall into any of those different models you talked about, would their behaviors be any different, or they are doing collaborative research with some other research group collecting data, publishing papers, all of that, it's the same, but you just are viewing it through those three different potential avenues.
Yes and no. So yes, however, like I said, there's some education and some actual restrictions that have been put on since 2018. So universities are much more aware about what is a problem and what is not a problem. And so, for example, the department publishes a list of academic entities that it has determined are entities that might be involved in foreign influence that are not great to collaborate with, and has let universities know that. Interestingly, the department has not said that if you collaborate with such an institution, if you have a scientific collaboration, like a co-authorship on a publication, the department has not said that that is necessarily a reason to completely deny funding. And I think because it wants that flexibility and it wants to really evaluate, and also because the idea of a co-authorship and a true collaboration are actually separate ideas, which I think is, when we come to the Safe Research Act, is a little bit of a sticking point between the department's current policy and the Safe Research Act.
Yeah, so let's jump into Safe Research Act. So as I understand it, one of the reasons that this is such a hot topic these days is because in the House passed version of the National Defense Authorization Act, there are sections which are called the Safe Research Act, and SAFE, S-A-F-E, is a clever acronym that I can't remember. But basically, this is about these research security questions. So just to, again, level set the conversation here, what is the Safe Research Act? Where did it come from, and what does it basically do?
Okay. So the National Defense Authorization Act, the piece of legislation, happens every year, authorizes things for the department. So that's not necessarily setting the budget, although it does have budget in it, but it authorizes. So it says what the department can do with its money and what policies should be in place. The committees that oversee the congressional committees are the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. They make their own drafts. Then they bring those drafts to the floor where the whole the House, the chamber votes or the Senate votes, right, to accept a version. And then later they go into conference and try to reconcile the House and the Senate versions and come up with a final version. The Safe Research Act did not come out of any of those committees. It came out of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. So this is a committee that has been actively working to figure out the risks from the Chinese Communist Party, has been very concerned about research security issues, and has drafted effectively a new framework under which universities should be conducting research security, and the government should or should not be funding universities. So a brand new framework. And it was not debated in the House or on the floor. It actually was inserted into the House NDAA after it went through the House Armed Services Committee to the House floor, but was just included without debate. So the reason I talk about the process is because those committees have actually spent a lot of time since 2018 or so coming up with policies, working with federal agencies, working with universities, trying to figure out a framework. This legislation comes outside of that and creates a new framework.
And on the day we're recording, the National Defense Authorization Act is in the conference process. So the House and the Senate conferees, the members and the staff, are dealing with the various differences between those two bills. One of those differences is this Safe Research Act, because nothing like it is in the Senate version of the National Defense Authorization Act. And so we're waiting to see what comes out the other side.
Correct.
Right? So, okay, it's hard to read. It's in legalese. So let's take it apart and explain it to people a little bit. Let's just start about who's it going to affect. So you want to start by sort of what does it do overall, and then who's it going to affect?
Okay. So overall, it limits which institutions and which individuals federal research agencies can fund. That's broadly speaking. The institutions are institutions of higher education. And the conditions have to do about whether they are collaborating or have a partnership with what the Safe Research Act considers a hostile foreign entity. So that's one piece. The other piece it does is it requires anybody who is going to apply for funding from a federal agency to disclose a lot of information about their engagements with foreign entities, namely China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and including travel, whether it's professional or not, collaborations with somebody who is in that country, students that they might have mentored, a large amount of information, more so than is currently required from individuals to disclose. And then it also sets some limitations on what people can do after they receive an award from a research award from a federal agency. So what they can do for 5 years after that award. That's kind of in broad strokes.
So it clearly affects universities.
Yes.
But does it limit it to academic research institutions, or does it affect small businesses who might get similar level early stage research funding?
So right now it's limited to institutions of higher education. However, we know that there is in the works some legislation that's going to be applicable to small businesses for the Small Business Innovation Research Award, the SBIR. But that currently it does not capture that.
So it doesn't capture SBIR right now.
No.
But would it affect small businesses or big businesses who might have existing research partnerships
Yes.
with some of these universities?
Yes.
How would it affect them?
Because the definition of a hostile foreign entity is so broad, it would include a U.S. business that might have some affiliation with an entity in a foreign country of concern. So if that business has that affiliation, an academic institution would not be able to partner on research with that business.
So if you got a R&D award from the Pentagon and wanted to partner with the university because they have particular expertise or facilities or have been doing work in that space, but they get caught up in the provisions that are described here, you potentially couldn't subcontract to.
Correct. And I was also saying in the reverse, if a university wanted to work with a business, that might potentially have some sort of secondary level of relationship with what that considers a hostile foreign entity, they also would not be able to.
Okay, now the government labs in places like NASA and Department of Defense and Department of Energy, they also collaborate with universities, and those kinds of collaborations might also be affected.
Correct.
These days, especially in the defense space, we're seeing a lot more interest from commercial firms to participate, and they have natural ties. I think about the pharmaceutical companies and materials companies and cybersecurity companies. They have natural ties with research institutions to do research, create intellectual property, flow people even. They would be tagged the same way, right? They'd be affected the same way.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the mechanics of how that works is usually you usually have a prime on an award, and then a sub award if you're going to work with the university. Sometimes you have a collaborative award where with the business and the academic institution both being kind of the primes and getting that award, but often it's a sub award, and the legislation doesn't distinguish, it doesn't mention anything about subawards. So my read is that it would capture subawards, but it doesn't make it clear.
And then the other group that these days is playing a role in defense innovation is the private capital community. Think venture capital, private equity, those kinds of places. They are also investing in startup companies spinning out of these universities. And so, in theory, I guess, if they want to be in the defense sector and want to work with some of these bigger university research institutions, they'd have to be paying attention to this as well.
Yes.
Okay. So, on the other hand, this all seems a little noble. We talked about China's behavior here. So, put yourself in the shoes of the authors here. What problem are they trying to solve?
They are trying to prevent China or these other 3 countries from being able to get access to information or research that the U.S. is funding, but not the whole in their minds, not the whole country as you know, not the country as a whole, but entities that they deem are problematic, that have certain properties like violations of human rights or contributing to weapon building. So it sounds really like, yes, of course we want to do that. The issue is that there's a couple issues, but one of them is that the definition of what is a hostile foreign entity is actually very, very broad. I think I actually truly believe that the intention of this legislation was to not make it so broad, was to be very targeted, but the way it's written actually captures many entities that we might not want to actually include on this list. And it also would capture secondary and tertiary effects that you might not think about. So, for example, it talks about research collaborators being affiliated with these institutions. But imagine a situation where you're collaborating with somebody in the UK, and somebody in the UK is collaborating with somebody in Germany, and somebody in Germany is collaborating with somebody in Italy, and that person in Italy has a student from China from a certain institution. You would have no visibility into that, probably at any point that you conducted your research. And then the published paper comes out, and the student is an author because, I don't know, they did one test, or who knows, now you are considered to have a collaborator that is a hostile foreign entity, and it makes you ineligible for funding from the department.
One of the terms in this legislation is hostile foreign entity, and you kind of talked about that. What about covered individual? What does that term mean?
Yeah, so a covered individual, it comes from previous NDAA language that was then implemented by the first Trump administration in National Security Presidential Memorandum 33. It basically means anybody who is meaningfully and substantially involved in the research, and that the federal agency determines is a covered individual. So by current definitions, it is the principal investigator, so the head of the lab who's getting the award, and any key personnel. It currently does not really encompass a student or a postdoc or somebody downstream.
One of the concerns with these sets of provisions, and in fact all provisions, and I'm guilty of writing a lot of provisions, very well intentioned, which didn't always quite work out the way we want, is how this then gets implemented, and whether or not in the federal agency's efforts to implement this, it's going to be more encompassing, maybe even all encompassing, and somehow capture some legitimate, even benign research, right?
Yeah,
Do you see that as a potential challenge here?
absolutely. I think the implementation of this is actually pretty impossible based on some of the definitions. The department maintains a list of entities that were set by a different National Defense Authorization Act. The criteria for what those are was set, and it's updated every year. Anybody from anywhere in the intelligence community can nominate these institutions, and then the department adjudicates and maintains this list, which is constantly updated. This includes that list, but also has really a little like kind of ambiguous definitions of what other entities might be. And it is not clear how a university would have any idea that whether an entity would fall under hostile foreign entity based on the definition, or what process a federal agency would have to understand whether a foreign entity falls under this broad definition. And who's maintaining that? Is every federal agency going to be assessing it differently? So there's the implementation of just what is a hostile foreign entity is going to be problematic. And also then there's, like I mentioned, the disclosures. Federal agencies would have to all of a sudden collect all this information. It's unclear how they would collect it, what they would do with it. And quite frankly, a lot of the people who are at the federal agencies involved in scientific funding are no longer there. There's been a shrinkage of people, and so from the federal agency perspective, how are they going to implement that? And then from a university perspective, how they're going to implement that, given that some of their indirect costs might be going away, right? Going to be limited. So that just logistically, how do you do that?
And this is going to touch not just the Pentagon, but the other federal funding agencies as well. So
correct. So there's extra restrictions on defense research, but the baseline prohibition that you cannot fund somebody who has a collaboration with a hostile foreign entity would apply to any federal funding agency.
So you're talking National Institutes of Health, and a National Science Foundation, NASA, Department of Energy, any federal agency that funds these research institutions.
Correct.
Will have to interpret this law, put out their guidance.
Yep.
And potentially it might be different, not just within different parts of Department of Defense, but across the federal agencies as well.
Yes.
And I guess in a time when acquisition reform in the Pentagon is all about speed and reducing compliance burdens and reducing regulatory burdens, this one seems to be going a little bit in the wrong direction.
Correct.
But on the other hand, there is a legitimate issue here too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let me say, so let's talk about the intentions, right? If the intentions are Department of Defense, your list of entities is incomplete. We think that there are riskier things that you're not considering. That's fine. There is a National Defense Authorization. It's public law that tells the department what needs to be on its list. Why not modify that, right? There's already policy and legislation about what information is collected and how it's used from covered individuals. You can work with the science committees, with the House Armed Services committees, with the interagency to modify those things. I think the discussion about whether there is or is not a problem is a valid discussion, and how you tweak it also is a valid discussion as well. I think that an overhaul of the system without acknowledging structures that are currently in place doesn't make sense. And I will say, the reason I think the committee thinks they need to do this is because they have done their own analysis of publications that have department research on them and looked at co-authorships, so affiliations of co-authors on papers. And they looked from 2023 to 2025, and they say, even though we've been doing things in research security, there's still all of these problematic relationships. And I think that so I've looked at the data. And first thing I'll tell you is that DoD's policy came out in 2023. So if DoD's policy came out in 2023 and it evaluates which funding it should give, but these are publications that came out in 2023, 2024, 2025, there's basically no way that any of these
Because
awards.
those were already funded at that time.
Exactly. And I think that anything that even if the things that they found, even the cases in which the things they found were problematic, I don't think that those would happen today, given existing policies.
Has there been an independent look at the policies that were put in place in that time frame and whether or not it's successfully starting to address these issues?
Yeah,
something like IG or Government Accountability Office or something like that?
Yeah, so actually the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine were tasked by Congress to come up with a framework to measure the effectiveness of these policies. So they're coming out with their report. I think they've either just come out with it or they're about to come out with their report on this.
Okay. All right. So if you could run the world here for a second,
Okay.
and understanding the importance of this problem and that the system always needs tweaking, what would you do to continue to be able to support this beneficial international cooperation, which in the past has resulted in some good things and certainly keeps us aware of what's going on all over the world, but not allow our secrets that we pay for to get stolen, right?
Yeah.
We go into work from the Pentagon context for the purposes of developing military capability, right?
Yeah.
That's the going in reason we do it. So legitimately, we should try to protect it when it's needed to be protected.
Yeah.
So what would you say is a good tweak to the system right now?
I think that the systems that we currently have in place are going to work if they're implemented correctly by everyone in the department and in federal agencies, and which I think universities are taking them seriously. So like NSF has the Secure Center that just came up that's educating universities. So I think that we need to make sure that the stuff that we're doing in the open, we're constantly evaluating whether we should be doing it in the open, and that we should be making decisions based on risk. I think we need the people in place at the agencies to be knowledgeable about evaluating that risk. And I think that there are people there that are able to do it. But I will say that I heard Michael Griffin, who was the Undersecretary of Defense Research and Engineering during the first Trump administration, talk once about this issue. And he said, you need to defend. You have to defend, right? But if all you're doing is defending, you're just staying in one spot. So he said we need offense. And what that really means is making sure that we are recruiting and keeping the best people in the US innovating. It means funding our science adequately. And the main thing it really actually means is when you do basic research out in the open, when you conduct it and it's published, is beating China to the punch on commercialization of it. Right? So we don't have really good methods of taking something from an academic lab and turning that into a capability fast. And that is something that I think if I could change anything, that's what I would change, is making sure that we're able to grab those ideas out of the lab and make that government investment in those technologies early on before China.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a couple of things that I've heard over the years. I had a boss who said, as important as it is to protect our national security secrets, it might be more important to keep creating new national security secrets.
Right.
And then we often talk about the same debate, which hasn't found its way quite here in the Safe Research Act, to the SBIR program, where the SBIR program, those small businesses are also arguably targeted by the Chinese for intellectual property theft, even cyber theft, while simultaneously we get people complaining, look, the Chinese are stealing the secrets from this program and saying this program is not effective.
Yeah.
And so that ties back to what you said. Well, we have the world's greatest research universities. We have the strongest tradition of government-funded basic research across our federal agencies, creating intellectual property, new businesses, military capability, better healthcare outcomes. It's our fault if we're not taking advantage of it. And these well-intentioned and well-managed, well-executed research security ideas totally make sense, but only in the context of we understand there's something precious to be protected here and that we need to keep grabbing the fruits of it as they come out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it goes back to that first question of why are you even doing it in the open? Could you do this behind closed doors? And I think that that's the first question you need to ask yourself. And if the answer is, I'm going to be slower or less effective or have huge knowledge gaps if I do this behind closed doors, then do it in the open and make sure that you're taking the risks into account.
Okay, last question. If NDIA members, whether they're big businesses, small businesses, universities, want to get involved in this conversation, learn more about these research security provisions that are already in place, the kinds of things that were done in 2023, where would you advise them to go to engage in this discussion?
Yeah, well, they could read the National Security Presidential Memorandum 33, which was the first structure that set forward what are risks that we should be taking into account. They can look into the NSF Secure Act. They could read the policies. I really like the Department of Defense policy for fundamental research, review of fundamental research proposals. So that's all open. And they can insert themselves into the debate about what does it really take for U.S. innovation to succeed, right? I mean, these are the people, these are the performers, right? They know, a company knows where that research came from. Did it come from an academic university? How did that happen? How did their first kernel of their technology, where did that come from? And make sure that you're protecting that.
That's great. Dr. Shanni Silberberg is with Lewis-Burke Associates. Thanks so much for this educational discussion.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with all of our latest content. We're available wherever you listen to your podcasts, including YouTube. We also want to extend appreciation to Booz Allen Hamilton for sponsoring today's episode. We encourage you, please visit ETI's website to sign up for our mailing list and register for our various webinars, events, and educational offerings, including our Tech 101 series. A special thank you to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in to Emerging Tech Horizons.